to be a closely choreographed fall economic statement yesterday was anything but that. Chrystia Freeland resigned as Minister of Finance. Liberal caucus members in revolt yesterday, and we saw a Prime Minister contemplating his future. And yes, there was a fall economic statement tabled revealing a fiscal deficit of $61.9 billion. So all of this comes as our country faces the tariff threat of the incoming Trump administration. So what led to yesterday's events in Ottawa? Does the fall economic statement in December impact investment decision-making? And what is the playbook ultimately to remove the tariff threat, or at least modify it somehow? I'm very happy to be joined here today by our expert panel. David Wolf, who is Portfolio Manager at Fidelity for Global Asset Allocation on that team. Corey Tanaik, he is co-founder and CEO of Rubicon Strategy and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper and Campaign Manager for Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Plus, David Hurley is here to join us. He is partner at Rubicon Strategy. He's also former Chief Strategist for Prime Minister Paul Martin and campaign manager to Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne. Welcome, gentlemen, all of you. Very glad to have a chance to speak with all of you. Some of you are joining us from home in Toronto, some from Boston. A warm welcome to all of you. So let's begin, actually, David Wolf, if you don't mind, with you. Take us into, and we'll accept questions for everyone who wants to send questions in over the next half hour. Actually, 45 minutes. We'll have this conversation. There's a lot to digest. What about the markets, David? What do we need to know? It was a rather modest reaction, but that said, what do you think investors are worried about right now?
Right, so there wasn't much of a reaction. Didn't see much out of Canadian stocks, Canadian bonds. Canadian dollar is down a little bit today. It actually breached the 70-cent level for the first time in several years. But it wasn't much of a move, and the U.S. dollar generally is up a little bit against other currencies this morning. So I don't think there was much of a market reaction to specifically what happened in Canada yesterday. And that makes sense when you look at economically, fiscally, financially. Yes, some of the numbers were different, but it wasn't, there wasn't really much in the way of news here. The balance deteriorated. That makes sense. The economy is weaker. So revenues were down and spending was up, and that's all fine. Again, I don't think there was really economic and financial news here. The news was the political news. I don't think I've ever quite seen anything like that from yesterday before. So I'm going to shut up and let the political folks, Corey and David, talk through the more interesting elements.
Well, we'll all have this as a discussion together. Corey, tonight, can we ask you, first of all, what's happening right now from sources that you have right now? What is going on behind closed doors in terms of decision making?
Well, seemingly the Prime Minister is contemplating his future and whether he's going to stay on or not. He had multiple opportunities to go out yesterday and to make that clear, and instead you had his staff and spinners saying that he was in a period of contemplation, considering a prorogation, considering resignation. That's a really unusual thing, because as a political leader, especially as a sitting prime minister, you are 100% staying until you're 100% going. And you don't really have this oscillation as to, well, I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Like that sort of instability.
Buying time?
It really, it can get out of hand really quickly. Clearly he was rocked back on his heels by the resignation of his longtime close ally and confidant, and just sort of, except for perhaps Dominic LeBlanc, the closest member to him in his own cabinet, his deputy prime minister, his finance minister. You don't get any closer to being prime minister than holding those roles. And to leave in such a jarring and damning way in terms of the letter that she put out. It was a repudiation of the fall economic statement. It was a repudiation of his strategy in dealing with the U.S. and this potential tariff fight that we're entering into with Trump. It was a repudiation of his seriousness in terms of dealing with economic things confronting Canadians. So, a break of with him on fiscal policy. Any one of those things would be, a showstopper, but you stack them all up and have it happen on the morning that you're supposed to be going out to present the feds. It's unprecedented.
Unprecedented. David Hurley, she communicated very well in that letter, no?
Yeah, we were suggesting on the Curse of Politics podcast that maybe all of her communications should have been in writing in her time in the cabinet, because a very effective writer. Um, but it was designed and executed for maximum damage to Trudeau without any question. And it did all the things Corey said, and perhaps even more damaging in my view, it attacked his motives. It said he was putting his political interest ahead of the national interest at a time of national crisis. I really can't imagine a more damaging thing you can say to a prime minister than that allegation. And you can't read it as anything other than, first of all, a person that was very, very angry about the way they had been treated. And secondly, a person who had decided to use that as a springboard to their own leadership campaign.
Okay, so let's get into the leadership campaign. And David Wolf, if you want to jump in here, by all means, but I'm going to go straight to Corey on this. Are we in a leadership campaign? Or, an unannounced one?
I think so. I think we are, and when it starts in earnest, won't be until the Prime Minister says he's leaving for sure. But if he has trouble getting to that obvious conclusion, I think the hits are going to keep on coming. When you looked at Anita Anand's commentary going into the cabinet meeting,
she seemed quite taken aback.
Well, she seemed like she was on the verge of saying some pretty tough things herself. As she turned away from the camera, you could see the track marks still on her back from when she was tossed under the bus by Trudeau only a few short months ago.
I'm not going to buy it, but okay.
But it strikes a real contrast with Trudeau's sort of glib comments about female presidential candidates and tisk-tisking the U.S. electorate for how not electing one, and talking about his feminism. Well, Jody Wilson-Raybould, Anita Anand, now Chrystia Freeland, he's got a problem. Jane Philpott. Clearly this is a challenge, and I think Anand's reaction to that is certainly going to be informed by what's happened to her, and which is in many ways very similar to what the experience that Freeland has just gone through yesterday. So I think there is a deep well of resentment there, and I think you're going to see more cabinet ministers come out. You saw Mark Holland basically refusing to answer the question whether he supports the Prime Minister. I think as close as he came to it is that he was going to be in politics for the long haul, which sounded more like a threat than an endorsement. So I think I think the pressure is mounting. Rumors are instead of 20-some people signing a letter in caucus to get rid of him, that number is now something north of 60. We're getting to a point where it's untenable to stay, and so we'll see how long it takes.
Okay, so this is exactly where I was going to go, David. Hurley, how long it takes. So just take us on a sort of sketch. If he prorogues Parliament, which would be, as I understand, in January, how long are we talking here? What could it get him to the spring, which was sort of being discussed anyway, the spring election?
Well, we don't know why he would prorogue. Is he proroguing to buy himself time to run in the next election, or is he proroguing to allow the Liberal Party to have a leadership?
Well, yes. Which one would he do? We don't know.
Well, we don't know, and I've always believed that people cling to these jobs as long as they can, and I'm not convinced that he is going to leave easily yet. I think there's still going to have to be pressure applied to him, and I have to continue to remind people that legally, there's not a thing anybody can do about this. There is no mechanism to remove him. No matter how many cabinet ministers come out against him, if he doesn't choose to leave, there is no way to remove him before the election. And to be honest, he should have come to this conclusion a long time ago. An absolutely disastrous position in the polls. I mean, they're at 20%. The Liberal Party has never gone into an election anywhere near that low in public opinion terms. It's unprecedented. They can't raise any money to mount an ad campaign. I mean, the arse has been out of this thing for a while, and he needs to recognize it.
David Wolf, any thoughts? You're watching, you're involved, and you're looking at the markets. But what's been struck you? There's some unbelievable things that happened, but give us a thought on what was truly unbelievable to you yesterday.
Well, so one of the remarkable things for me, and getting back to the sort of the economics of it. So I've read fall economic statements, budgets, et cetera, for nearly 30 years. And you're used to a certain tone from these documents that, kind of regardless of the situation, there's going to be a positive spin on it. There's going to be, playing up the good stuff and ignoring the bad stuff. But yesterday's document, so I started reading it last night, and I got, 2 or 3 pages in, and I'm thinking, are you sure you're talking about Canada?
There wasn't a lot of love.
The tone in terms of the speaking about the economy was so dissonant with, I think, folks' views on the economy and their own experience. So to give an example, the document talked about, I think it was 330,000 new jobs created over the past year in Canada, which sounds really good, and it was one of the better years that we've had in our history. But then you realize, well, the population went up by more than 1 million, so what you're actually talking about is only about a third of the newcomers were actually able to find a job. That sounds pretty bad. So there are lots of ways to spin these things, but I mean, maybe hooking back to the political issues, it was just a real chasm between the way the economy was talked about and I think what's actually out there in the public in terms of what people see and feel.
Absolutely. Let's go to the discussion of tariffs and the new incoming Trump administration, what we are all getting ready for in Canada and what the government needs to be getting ready for. We're not ready. How much of the tariff discussion is playing out in Ottawa? There are a lot of countries around the world where they're shaking the trees of incumbents.
Yeah, well, I think yesterday wasn't being talked about at all, really.
Right. Okay.
And so, where you saw that conversation taking place, which was happening simultaneously, is the premier's meeting down the road in Mississauga. You have, I think, a real leadership void at the federal level right now in this. I think the government is in a perpetual crisis management mode right now, trying to get through the next non-confidence motion. Parliament seized by a months-long filibuster, inability to pass public estimates, inability to table a FES in a normal way. All of these things are a government that's very distracted, very worried about its day-to-day survival, as opposed to focusing on this economically existential threat that we're staring down the barrel of from an incoming Trump presidency. I think premiers and others want to see, what steps can we take to de-escalate the situation with the United States, to avoid having unilateral tariffs imposed, to avoid having to do countervailing tariffs or other actions against the U.S. We don't want a trade fight. But, to avert that, where is the new spending on defense? Well, there was a lot of new spending in that FES, but none of it on defense.
A small portion, but not a big portion.
Well, not a big portion, not anywhere close to the additional $20 billion needed to get to 2%, which, by the way, if you look at the premiers, they're all agreed on needing to do that. And the spokesperson for it is Wab Kinew, an NDP premier, right? So, there's a broad consensus around this, but there's no focus. So you have, almost $20 billion in new spending on climate change initiatives, but nothing really meaningful on defense to close that gap. It seems like a federal government that's disconnected from what the challenge that we're facing from the United States. A prime minister disconnected from the reality of the support he has both nationally and even in his own caucus and cabinet. It just seems like a distracted, disconnected government that's worried about its survival over the national interest, which is, I think, pretty much exactly what Chrystia Freeland put in her letter yesterday.
It certainly seemed that was what she was addressing. David Hurley, tariffs as the umbrella story, but ultimately what you saw in the fall economic statement in December, that led you to think that tariffs was really the issue.
Well, I don't know that I saw anything in the fall economic statement that led me to think that tariffs are the issue, but certainly in the country, tariffs are the issue. And so I think actually yesterday prompted a lot of people to start, who hadn't previously been of this point of view, start to say there actually does need to be a federal election in Canada, because we need to stop the dysfunction that Corey was talking about and have a government that can focus on this challenge. There's a few complicating factors, though. First of all, I don't know, and I don't think any of us know, that Mr. Trump's conditions for dropping the tariffs actually have anything to do with the border. And that just could have been something he said in a tweet. It's equally plausible that he thinks that tariffs are essential economic policy for repatriating American manufacturing jobs. It's equally possible that he thinks that tariffs are essential to replace taxation increases to pay for some of his spending, and that that's what his revenue plan is. So, we could go off and spend $20 billion a year on defense and maybe not affect the tariff thing at all, which is why I think the premier's efforts at and what the federal government did in the last go round of applying domestic American economic pressure on the administration is the only plausible path through this. I think if you start negotiating, you could be negotiating with yourself.
Well, I think I disagree with David on this.
Okay.
I think Trump 2.0 is a lot more sophisticated and a lot more deliberate in what it's doing and what they're saying. The president doesn't have the ability to level unilateral tariffs absent Congress. And it'd be very difficult to get those measures passed through Congress. He can on border security. He can on national security. And so, I think it's a sign of sophistication that is what's put in the window. I think what's clear when you look at what the administration has been saying, what he's been saying, throughout his campaign, is Chinese transshipment is a big problem within NAFTA. He doesn't want to have Chinese goods coming into Canada and Mexico and finding their way into the U.S. tariff-free.
And you heard Doug Ford, his brother, directly addressing that yesterday.
Yes, I think that's one, but I think you can take at face value that that in the world that we're living in right now, being one of the only countries, certainly one of the only major countries, that is not meeting its NATO commitment. The rest of NATO is talking about moving to 3%, and we're not getting anywhere near 2%. Every one of these countries around the world would rather spend that money on something else. But being the freeloader is, I think that game is up. And if you don't want to be talked about as the 51st state, if you don't want to be called the 51st state, then you got to fund your military like you're an actual real country. And that's something that Canada has not been doing. And I think not only is the United States and Donald Trump had enough of that, the Biden administration had enough of that. I think every other NATO country leader has had enough of that. And I think Canada needs to put on its big boy pants and start acting like a country and funding its military like we are a country.
David Wolf, going into the details of what is driving a deficit and making it more or less acceptable from your perspective, one way or the other, it's a heavy weight to have it. Would more defense spending versus some of the other things that you saw in the fall economic statement make it better or worse? Can you comment on that? The components of the deficit?
Yeah, sure. So why don't we flip back to the tariffs, which I think, as Corey and David both pointed out, are the real economic threat in Canada. It's not whether the deficit is 5 or 10 billion, smaller or larger, what have you. If 25% or more or less or what have you tariffs are implemented on Canadian goods and services going to the U.S., that is an enormous problem for the Canadian economy. An order of magnitude above anything else that we're talking about. To David's point, do we have any idea whether this is actually going to be enacted, what we need to do to counter it, et cetera? I don't think we do. I don't think anybody does, probably including the president-elect as well. One thing to note, though, is it almost, at least at this stage, doesn't really matter. Just the threat is causing an enormous amount of uncertainty among Canadian businesses. So if you're thinking about expanding your business or buying a piece of equipment or your own plant, and you don't know and may not know for a long time to come whether you're going to have access to the U.S. market, you're not going to do it. And so that's already a big issue facing the Canadian economy. We've got others, obviously, the wall of mortgage renewals, the lousy productivity, et cetera. So none of us knows what the outcome is going to be with respect to the tariff fight, but it's fairly clear to me that just the uncertainty around it is adding to the challenges that, if we weren't in a recession already, and I think, the jury is out on that, there's a good chance that we will be in pretty short order.
David Hurley, how would it change the landscape right now? Maybe you want to comment on what's been said, but I'm just curious if we slip into a recession that is noted while we still have a leadership issue going on, or a general election has not yet been called. I mean, then what?
Well, it would obviously, make the prospects of the government getting reelected even less likely if such a measurement tool exists at the moment. That level of precision is difficult to calibrate. A recession. Canadians think we're in a recession.
Yeah, that
right?
seems, yeah.
Canadians, it feels like a recession to people out there, and so if economic conditions deteriorate, then what is an already terrible mood in the country? You know that only about 20% of Canadians, given a choice, think that Canada's headed in the right direction. 80% think the country's headed in the wrong direction. This is astonishingly negative consensus about things. If you were to pile a recession on top of that, I think we would have a really, really unhappy population. That would have some political ramifications as well. But let me layer onto that an answer to your previous question, which is, I don't disagree with Corey's analysis about defense spending one iota. But what Corey knows as well as I do is that Canadians place almost no priority on defense spending. It's one of the lowest priorities that Canadians have for government spending. And 2% would be an additional 20 billion, 3% would be an additional 30 billion. And I cannot personally see my way through the politics of anybody, Pierre Poilievre, Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney, anybody, either raising taxes by $20 to $30 billion or cutting existing spending by $20 to $30 billion. I just don't see that.
Well, I can, and we saw it in the feds. I think that the amount of spending that this government has done on climate change initiatives that do not enjoy the support of the public right now, and I think are disconnected from the priorities of most Canadians, would be a good place to start. And I think we've got to get the economy growing. We've got to, and the last thing that is going to help that is getting in a trade fight with our largest trading partner. Like the price of not dealing with some of these issues can be raised to be so high that you have to do it. You have to bite the bullet and do it, because the alternative is so dire and so cataclysmic to your economy that it is. I think it changes that normal math that David's talking about. That I agree has been the case over time, but a lot of other things have changed. We've got a hot war in Europe right now. We've got threat of further or similar disruptions around Taiwan with China. Like, the world is changing, and it's becoming a lot more serious place. I don't think the Pierre Trudeau really wanted to buy tanks and put them in Europe during the Cold War. That was a big deal back then. Did it anyway, because if he wanted to be a part of NATO, he had to do it. So we bit the bullet and got it done. And I think we're in a similar position today.
Yeah, really interesting.
Hey,
David
Corey.
Wolf?
Hey,
Okay.
Corey, if a Poilievre government has defense spending at over 2% at the end of its first term, dinner's on me at the restaurant of your choice.
I've got expensive tastes around dinner, David, as you know.
Yeah, you should really use that. You should really use that. David Wolf, a couple of questions coming in. I'll put this one to you. You're in Boston. You've been having dinners and connections with investors in the United States, and you always do around the world. What do you think investors ultimately, and also colleagues of yours in Boston, how are they reacting to the last 24 hours, and what do they think? They probably don't look to Canadian politics very often, but it suddenly got interesting.
Yeah, so they barely look at all, and I've had a number of people. So I'm in our head office here in Boston this week, and folks who never pay any attention to Canada and don't manage money in Canada have been coming up to me, even just this morning, what is going on? So it's definitely hitting radars, not only politically, but in terms of economics, financial markets around the world. It's not obvious what gets done about it. I mean, I don't think anybody is going to all of a sudden wake up to the fact that Canada has these vulnerabilities. But Pamela, you and I think a lot of the folks who are watching this know our position in terms of the Canadian economy and how that's feeding into the positioning of our multi-asset funds, which is Canada's a small, narrow market. We've got a lot of vulnerabilities. Some of those are now in the process of being realized. And in that context, there are a lot of, it's a wide world out there. We have access to asset classes all over the world. Here in the U.S., the outlook looks quite a bit brighter, but even in some other parts of the world. So we've been underweight Canada. We've been in particular underweight the Canadian dollar, and that's been, helping in terms of tailwinds to performance in the funds. And nothing that's happened in the last 24 hours really changes that at all.
No, and even with as your call on sort of where the Canadian dollar goes, and it has sunk a little bit in the last little while and breached that 70-cent level. Let's.
Can I just jump in and say, by the way, that I know from years and years of public opinion research about economic issues that there is no metric that Canadians rely on more heavily to tell them how the economy is doing than the value of the dollar. So as the dollar drops, people assume that means our economy is weakening.
Right. Well, there's a larger divergence story. David Wolf, do you want to bring that in?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing that occurs to me, so I agree, David, just, my observations as a Canadian and out in the public that, it's front and center. And, just about everybody in the country hopes to or wants to, particularly this time of the year, go to the United States and say, wow, 70 cents, 65 cents, whatever it is, it's hard and it makes you feel bad. I mean, if things get really bad, who knows how many times I'm going to come back to Boston? Maybe I just have to Zoom all the time because I can't afford it. I mean,
you'll have to get David Hurley to take you out for dinner in Boston. Make that deal happen.
I definitely want in on that dinner. Even in Ottawa or Toronto is fine. It doesn't have to be.
Do you guys insure
in Boston?
Maybe we should be doing that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, as I said earlier, the tone of the economic statement was just so at odds with the public mood, and I think what any sort of objective observer would say about the economic environment in Canada. And look, Canada is the only place that has issues. Obviously, Europe, not only the hot war, but tariffs, potentially the U.S. there, and in China and what have you. So it's not like Canada is a basket case and everywhere else is fine. But we have our issues. Other countries have their issues, and one of my jobs as portfolio manager is not to find a place with no issues, because that doesn't exist, but where are we being compensated for the risks that we're taking as investors? And again, in most cases, that's outside of Canada, not inside of Canada, and that's how we're deploying capital.
And it was before everything that happened last night, and it continues. And David Wolf, we're going to say thank you and goodbye for now, because you have to leave right at noon Eastern time. Corey and David Hurley will stick with us here. We've got lots of things to pull apart here. David Wolf, thank you. Great to see you. Joining us from Boston. Let's go to what happened on Friday, if you don't mind, just to sort of dig into it a little bit. David Hurley, one of the things that happened on Friday, along with other things, was this announcement of pensions, Canadian pensions, being allowed to invest more than the 30%. The limit was changed. And this was a Chrystia Freeland announcement. This was her getting out ahead of it. And it was an interesting announcement on the Friday and then everything that came afterwards. Your thoughts on the pension announcement?
Well, first of all, it was made, many people remarked on how emotional she appeared at that announcement.
I know, I thought so too.
And we now know that she'd had her Zoom call with the Prime Minister where he'd informed her that he was moving her before she did that news conference. So she already knew that she was out as the Minister of Finance when she was making that news conference. Listen, there are people that are more expert in this than I am, but as much as I desire capital investment in Canada and more of it, I am extremely worried about anything that starts to skew pension plan decisions from pure return basis. And I'm very nervous about increasing government attempts to encourage pension funds to invest in Canada as opposed to places where they get the greatest return. Yeah. We're all counting on this money. And we all know that if politics gets involved, these funds will make less money than they would otherwise make. So I've been worried for some time the government's on a slippery slope on this. But the minister was certainly excited about the announcement.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What did you take from that?
Well, I think I share David's concern as somebody who wants to see our pension funds have a maximum benefit for Canadians and be stable and all of that. But as somebody who practices politics, I could see why she'd be excited about the announcement, because that kind of talk is something that I think you can get a lot of Canadians nodding their head around. I think they might not like the long-term implications of these policies, and I don't think they're well articulated. And I'm not sure you're going to find a lot of politicians in the other parties who are going to stand up and take issue, on the basis that David just did. Although I think David's correct. So, this is I do think a slippery slope for that reason, and something that people should really keep an eye on. And if people are concerned about that, they might want to spend some time articulating the reasons why, and because I don't think there's a ready-made crowd of political actors who are going to jump in otherwise. It
seems like an easy message to sell in the sense that it's a business investment tool in Canada. Why not use it? But as you say, the long-term investment possibilities that we just heard from David Wolf, being able to go around the world, can be very valuable ultimately. Okay, let's talk a little bit about
just on that, for one other thing, I actually think you could say the same thing about DEI investing and all of that too, right? So there are many other criteria that I think have sort of insidiously permeated pension investing decisions, and the ethical basis for investing, I think, should be on the sidelines too. But you're not seeing that in some cases either. So anyway, it's, I think, a more complicated story.
It probably is. We don't have time for it here right now, but we'll ultimately probably have to revisit this one. What happens to Mark Carney's ability to come into this mess? David Hurley, there is some thought that he might be one of the leadership candidates. It's been a strange story to follow, but are his prospects, if he were to come in, any better or worse than they were yesterday?
Well, I think that to the extent that Ms. Freeland's actions may have advanced Mr. Trudeau's timetable for departure, then it makes things more positive for Mr. Carney. Because I think everybody agrees that Mr. Carney, to be successful, would likely need some time as Prime Minister before facing the people in an election to demonstrate a little bit of what he has in mind and how he is different. My views on Mark Carney are this. I think Mark Carney is the most remarkable Canadian of our generation. I think he's the Lester Pearson of our time. I think nobody in Canada for many, many years has been as well connected, as well respected, as accomplished globally as Mark Carney is. But none of that prepares you for Canadian politics. And so it is while I don't have any doubt that he has the stuff to be a great prime minister, I don't know that he has the stuff to be a great political leader. And he doesn't have a lot of time to demonstrate or pick that up. So I think that Mr. Carney is not going to come into this race, if he runs, as the front runner, but he'll come in as one of the front runners. And polling has consistently shown that he is the person around whom, at the moment, most Canadians are prepared to reconsider the Liberal Party if he's the leader. And I'm sure in part that's because he's not associated with Mr. Trudeau. And I think it's also likely in part because of the other accomplishments of his life.
Thoughts? Thank you.
Well, I agree that what happened yesterday is probably helpful to Carney, because it's speeding up or creating an opportunity for there to be a change in leadership. But I think it's probably hurt a little bit in that what happened yesterday has, I think, vaulted Freeland back into consideration as a top tier leadership aspirant. And I don't think that's where she was 2 days ago. I think she'd largely been written off. I think she was viewed as being too close to Trudeau, but she's created a lot of space between her and him, and provided a rationale for that space that's not just political ambition. So I think in that sense, it's probably not been the most helpful thing to Mark Carney. I'll disagree with David on how I think things will go if Carney gets in. I think in the public mood that we're talking about right now, I don't think people are looking at someone like Mark Carney as a safe set of hands to manage the economy, as much as they're looking at somebody who's a little too foreign, a little too wealthy, a little too focused on the global fight on climate change, et cetera. I think there are a lot of things there that are very much in the Michael Ignatieff column of attributes. But I do agree with David that he's an untested commodity as a political leader, and some of the things that he's done are related or politics adjacent, but figure skating is adjacent to hockey, and I don't think you'd want to put on your figure skates and
they look great behind us, don't you think? Here at City Hall in Toronto.
But I think you sometimes you see that
Right.
being a jockey and being a horse, they're not the same. Like you don't want to switch spots readily. So we'll see how it goes. But he's an unproven commodity, and I think in a world where more populist approaches and focuses on affordability and being relatable in that way, it's probably a bit of a hill for him to climb.
David Hurley, anything to add there? Otherwise, I want to ask about Dominic LeBlanc, who is the new finance minister. Anything to add there quickly?
No, I just think we're in a zone where populism is the order of the day.
Yeah.
Corey's exactly right. We saw the same dynamic at play in the U.S. election as well. And that all plays against Mr. Carney, but it plays against the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party represents the establishment, the institutions of this country, and they're running against a person who says all those institutions are broken and bad and hurting you. And I don't know that the Liberal Party will be successful by running somebody who kind of agrees with Mr. Poilievre, but not completely agrees with Mr. Poilievre. I think we're probably better off to run the best exemplar of what we do represent as we can possibly find. In my mind, that's Mr. Carney.
Okay. Dominic LeBlanc wrote you this morning. He was up early with a cup of coffee for his 15 portfolios that he's running. What are his thoughts? He's the new finance minister here.
Well, I think if we do end up with the Prime Minister resigning, if it's a quick leadership race in the sense that it's a caucus vote as opposed to membership-based, more broad spectrum leadership, more traditional leadership, I think he stands a good chance of winning. I think he's very popular within that caucus. I think he'd be associated with Trudeau, but I think he's also viewed as somebody who has a lot of political skills, a lot of communication skills. I think he's a familiar face with those people. So I kind of view LeBlanc as the front runner if it's a caucus vote. I think he has a steeper hill to climb himself in terms of just not having the same level of public profile that a Carney or a Freeland has.
Does he have more of a common touch, though, that would fit with maybe a more populist
He's a very
moment?
charming guy and a very good retail politician. So, for instance, he gets along very well with, I think, all of the premiers, including the ones that don't share his party designation. Like, he's a close friend, I think it's fair to say, with Doug Ford. But I think he has equally good relationships with most of the other premiers. Even, as much as Premier Scott Moe likes anyone in the Liberal government, Dom LeBlanc would probably be at the top of the likability list. Now, that probably still means he'd rather, hit him with his car than, sit down with him for dinner. But he would like him the most, right?
Okay. David Hurley, there's a couple of questions coming in here. What is the likelihood that the Canadian government will respond with tariffs of its own? So we'll come back to the economics here of what we're dealing with, the much bigger story, the Canadian political story, sort of within a bigger story here. What is the appetite for Canada hitting back?
Well, it's not clear, and the premiers have certainly sent very divergent signals on this. So this is an area where pulling together Team Canada is going to require all the bonhomie and charisma that Dominic has, because we've heard from the Premier of Ontario a great willingness to roll up the sleeves and duke it out with Trump over this, talking about denying electricity exports. But boy, from the Western premiers and some of the Atlantic premiers who deal in oil and gas, we've heard vitriolic opposition to the notion that their exports would be in any way put at greater risk in order to fight back against these tariffs. They're very much in the world of let's prevent these tariffs from ever happening. But if the tariffs happen, I think it will be very difficult because of the politics of our country to generate a Team Canada response. That might be somewhat ameliorated by a new a different federal government with a fresh mandate. I concede that. But I think the core oppositions in places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland are going to remain the same.
Yeah, what do you think, Corey?
Yeah,
Hitting back.
I think that's accurate. But look, I think everyone wants to avert this, and that's why the focus on, all right, so what are the Americans really saying? What is it that, how do we avert that happening? I think there's a broad consensus that should happen. I think there's a lot of frustration that I'd say all of the premiers think that the federal government is not on the right track in terms of how to avert this. So that's step one. If you actually end up in a fight, you're going to have to fight. And
it might be 4 years long.
Like God forbid that's the outcome, but like if you're in a fight, you're going to be fighting, and like that's just a fact. And we can lament as to whether or not something could have been done to avoid that. I think everyone is of the same mindset around the premier's table that everything to avoid that should be done that's reasonable. But if you end up in a fight anyway, you're going to have to fight back. And I think that's just the way the world works. So, what that looks like, what things are targeted, there'll be, I think, a pretty vigorous debate around that. And I think ultimately the federal government is going to have to be a bit of an arbitrator of that debate, because I'm not sure you're going to get consensus around that table otherwise.
Very, very interesting. I'd like to ask each of you for maybe one or two things to watch for. And you can't say you're looking for the resignation of the Prime Minister, because we're all looking for that headline one way or the other, whether it goes, regardless of what you want. Everyone knows that that's a possibility. So beyond that, what are you going to be watching over the next, short term, like next 72 hours kind of thing? Maybe that's the only thing you're looking for in the next 72 hours. Let's stretch it out to 2 weeks. David Hurley, you're first.
I'll be looking for two things. I'll be looking for whether the pressure increases on the Prime Minister through additional ministerial resignations, as particularly as other people who aspire to the leadership decide that, like Chrystia Freeland, they need to cut themselves some distance from Mr. Trudeau and find a reason to leave him. So that's one thing I'll be looking for. And the second thing I'll be looking for is to see whether Jagmeet Singh ever wakes up and realizes that he has no interest in allowing the Liberals to change their leader, and that he should be forcing an election before they get to do that.
Can you just spread that out a little bit? What do you mean? Why? Why is he?
Well, the NDP have an historic opportunity, and if they were better, it would truly be historic. Like I'm telling you, if they swapped in Rachel Notley for Jagmeet Singh today, they could deal a death blow to the Liberal Party right now.
Well, she's looking for a job.
It is only the weakness of Mr. Singh that is preventing this from happening. The Liberal vote has hemorrhaged, and it has gone entirely to the Conservatives. And we saw that in a by-election again last night. The NDP aren't attracting any of it. But nonetheless, when the Liberal Party is very, very weak, that's when there is opportunity for the NDP. And I think we're all agreed that as much of a powerful political force as he once was, Justin Trudeau in 2024 is the weakest offering the Liberal Party can make. And so he represents the NDP's best opportunities to make gains and to bury the Liberal Party. And if they allow the Liberals off the mat to choose a popular leader, get back up to 30% of the vote and cement their position as the alternative to the Conservatives, they will have let what was a truly historic potential realignment opportunity for themselves go by.
Well, I completely agree with both of those points, but I pointed out earlier this morning on our podcast with
you
David.
guys just did a whole practice run for this.
Yeah, we
right
did.
Before.
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, the federal NDP has never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Like, it is so unlike its provincial cousins in Western Canada and occasionally in the Maritimes, where they actually fight to win, and where they're more than just a collection of disgruntled interest groups. Like they just seem to always miss the larger strategic play. And
so will they? Like, are you actually looking for that?
Like,
or are you assuming it won't?
Well, I don't think their caucus is going to throw out Singh, which is probably like there should be two leadership races going on right now, one for the NDP and one for the Liberals.
You just made news.
But
okay.
And I would give, I would count the amount of time that Singh's leader after the next election, and probably in hours and days, not weeks and months.
Okay.
Like I think he's an enormously weak leader. But I think we saw that played out again yesterday, where he came out saying the Prime Minister must step down, and then the follow-up question, which is the most obvious question probably in the history of questions, so are you going to take down the government in a confidence motion? And he's, well, I couldn't go there. I couldn't, why would I?
There's no answer.
So he just looked weak, and he looked like he's propping up the government, and he looked like he, couldn't back up his convictions, with any kind of actions, and which just is the worst of all formulas for that. You're then even more associated and blamed for the continuance of the Trudeau government than members of its own cabinet, right? Because your mandate is supposed to be somewhat different. You're an opposition party that refuses to oppose. And I think there's no future in that, which is why the NDP are sitting at 18%, despite the fact that the Liberals are at a historic low, like 20%. And I think what it's going to result in is something that's going to make me happy, obviously, as a Conservative. I think the largest Conservative majority probably ever elected in the history of Canada is what you're looking at if those two things continue to play out.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing your brains, both gentlemen, David Hurley, Corey Teneycke, and David Wolf, who left us a few minutes ago but shared his thoughts on how you invest through this, which is kind of doing what he's been doing all this time. Thank you both for joining us in studio.
My pleasure.
And virtually. All the very best to you, David, and to Corey for the holidays.
Thank you.